Dr. Seuss, the best-selling children's author of all time, revolutionized the way kids learn to read with one simple idea. He made it fun.
He was the only guy I know who's ever invented words because he needed a gox. Have you ever boxed a gox? You know, in socks?
He takes full advantage of the idea that anything goes. He can do anything he possibly wants to.
So they slumped in their chairs, too glum to complain. And to make matters worse, it started to rain.
I, Ted Geisel, am perhaps better known to the juvenile reading public as Dr. Seuss. My current bestseller, The Cat in the Hat, has sold so far almost 250,000 copies. Signed, Ted Geisel. And now, panel, we have three gentlemen, each one claiming to be Ted Geisel or Dr. Seuss.
While Dr. Seuss is the most famous children's author of all time, Theodore Geisel remains more of an enigma.
You know, Cat in the Hat and all those books, I think those really become like the first books you ever read when you're a child. And the brilliance of those books, I think, is that Geisel's rhythm that he writes in makes you want to read.
Number 3, how many pages are there in The Cat in the Hat?
22.
His most beloved character wreaks havoc at home. Another character is a recluse who steals toys from children.
These stockings are the first things to go.
Number 1, which is your favorite of all the animals you've ever
Oh, Yertle the Turtle.
He was uncomfortable with cameras and the children who sent him more than 1,000 fan letters a week.
People think naturally that a writer of children's books must just love children. But Ted was afraid of children, I felt, because he had had almost no experience with them.
Number 2, why did you pick that particular name? Any particular reason?
It's a complete phony. That's my middle name, and I put the doctor in front of it.
Oh, Seuss is your middle name. I see.
When he created, he chain-smoked. When he relaxed, he drank vodka on the rocks.
He didn't really enjoy being around a lot of people. I think that he lived in a very private kind of world.
So will the real Ted Geisel please stand up?
Theodore Seuss Geisel liked to tell people that he observed life from the wrong end of the telescope. He had an eye and an ear for seemingly silly details. He was born on March 2nd, 1904 in Springfield, Massachusetts. The town and Ted's idyllic childhood would be the defining influences on the artist the world would know by the name of Dr. Seuss. His neighbors had names that would reappear in his books: Terwilliger, Bickelbaum, and McGilligan.
When he experienced something at any point in his life, it stayed with him. He remembered names, he remembered activities. Everything went into that memory bank. He never lost the ability to see things through the eyes of a child.
Ted's mother, Henrietta, was the daughter of a German baker. His father, Theodore, worked in his German family's brewery, one of the largest in New England. He was a quiet perfectionist.
And he said this to me in my life: you will never be sorry for anything you didn't say. And I think he lived by that rule, and if he were angry at something, he simply wouldn't talk to the person anymore.
Like his father, Ted would keep his deepest feelings to himself. A loner by nature, his closest friend growing up was his sister Marnie. They played in nearby Forest Park, 500 acres of open fields, pools, and most importantly for Ted, a zoo. Ted's father took him to the zoo every Sunday. He also gave his son a set of pencils and encouraged him to draw. I was trying to do real animals, Ted later said, but I'd put too many knuckles on them. In Springfield's proud German community, Nettie Geisel, an imposing presence at 6 feet and 200 pounds, would read to her children in 2 languages. More than anyone else, Ted later said, my mother was responsible for the rhythms in which I write.
And one of Ted's early memories was of his mother repeating the sing-song version of what kinds of pies were available that day. Even in his 80s, he would sing apple, mince, strawberry, and go through logical ones and then end up with and squash.
Nettie made a point of reading to Ted and Marnie every night before bed. Children's books of the day were how-to manuals of moral rectitude.
2 of the books that he and my mother read as a child, and I still have these books, are Goops and More Goops. They were imaginative, and how, like, one of the rhymes was, when you're eating soup, like little ships set out to sea, I push my spoon away from me. And this was a way of teaching manners.
Before Ted's 13th birthday, world events would turn his happy childhood upside down. After the United States entered World War I, anti-German sentiment spread throughout the country and included Americans of German descent. Ted Geisel, also a brewer's son, was an easy target. Schoolmates often called him that drunken Hun. He would never forget it.
I think he was very aware that groupthink, i.e., hating Germans, could be very painful and thoughtless. He was not a group person. He didn't belong to organizations. He was an independent thinker.
And someone, as his grades would reflect, not suited to the regimented Ivy League world he found at Dartmouth College in New Hampshire. Ted Geisel was more drawn to the campus humor magazine.
But of course that is a place where you get to write pretty much anything you want within reason. It was a place for him to write nonsense verse and to do ridiculous cartoons, which obviously stood him in good stead.
During Ted's senior year, an incident involving a bootleg pint of gin cost him his title of editor-in-chief. His work continued to appear under pseudonyms like El Pasteur or Thomas Mott Osborne, the name of the warden at Sing Sing prison. Sometimes, Ted would even use part of his own.
It was his middle name, and it was also his mother's maiden name, which was pronounced Seuss in the German way, but when he started to use it, everyone just looked at it and said Seuss, and that's what lasted.
A fellow student said everything Ted did seemed to be a surprise, especially to him. Upon his 1925 Dartmouth graduation, he found himself on a ship bound for England, his first trip outside the United States.
He simply never stopped playing hooky from the real world. He loved escaping, and it was a protective thing also.
Ted's destination was Oxford University. His idea was to become a professor of English literature. But during lectures, his mind wandered. Often sitting behind Ted, astonished by his drawings, was Helen Marion Palmer, a Wellesley graduate 5 years his senior, getting her master's degree in teaching. One day after class, she told him he was crazy to become a professor.
The luckiest thing that ever happened to him was that he met Helen, because she instantly recognized his talent. She heard Ted when nobody else heard him. She was the one who discovered him.
Helen would receive her master's degree, and Ted, heeding her advice, would drop out of Oxford after his first year. They spent the summer of 1926 crisscrossing Europe, riding gondolas in Venice, a motorcycle through Paris, and indulging Ted's love of English castles. By year's end, he'd asked Helen Palmer to become his wife. The child inside Ted Geisel also knew what he wanted to be when he grew up. 1926, Helen Palmer had given Ted Geisel the confidence to drop out of Oxford and pursue a career as a cartoonist. 1 year later, they found themselves married, living in Manhattan, with Ted earning $75 a week at the leading humor magazine of the day. Ted soon added Doctor to his pseudonym, explaining straight-faced that it was compensation for the doctorate he never received at Oxford. When it came to his name, the story always changed.
He took his mother's name, Seuss, because he was saving Geisel for the day when he wrote the great American novel or history or whatever. He was brilliant.
The course of Ted's one-year-old career would change with a single cartoon. A knight confronts his nemesis with the line, "Darn it all, another dragon, and just after I sprayed the whole castle with Flit." Ted was promptly hired by the Bug Spray's advertising agency. Flit sales soared as his catchphrase, "Quick, Henry, the Flit," became part of the American vernacular. The Bug Spray's parent company, Standard Oil, turned Ted's imagination loose on other products.
I think it's very hard for people today to understand who Ted was in his own time. He was a hugely popular figure in the media before he really became popular as a children's book writer.
Ted capitalized on his fame with a modestly successful mail-order business. Fans received mounted creatures made with shells and horns his father had sent him from the Springfield Zoo, which he now ran after Prohibition had closed the Geisel Brewery.
Collecting bills isn't an unusual occupation, but collecting bills, beaks, and horns most certainly is. And with them, to create birds and beasts never to be seen outside of a padded cell or the dreams of a whimsical genius, well, that's still more unusual. And Theodore Seuss Geisel of New York is the whimsical genius in question. His most celebrated creation is the blue-green Abelard, which comes to life, but only when nobody is looking. The twin-screw Antwerp. The kangaroo bird, so called because it carries its young in a pouch before eating them on buttered toast. And if it wants an egg, it just lays it. And the Mulberry Street unicorn.
Ted's creatures would keep him company, hanging on his studio walls for the rest of his career. At the height of the Depression, Ted's success permitted an annual excursion with Helen that could last for months. In less than a decade, they would visit over 30 countries, returning home from each with at least one fantastic story.
You know, Ted would tell me these outrageous tales of, shootouts in a dusty Mexican street and falling into the water trough as the bullet whizzed over his head, kind of thing. And I think, was this a movie or is he faking,
In 1936, the course of Ted's life would change again aboard a homeward-bound cruise ship. Ted could not sleep during a storm. Vodka in hand, he began writing a story that harked back to his happy childhood in Springfield, about a boy embellishing the story of his walk home from school.
That can't be my story. That's only a start. I'll say that a zebra was pulling that cart. And that is a story that no one can beat when I say that I saw it on Mulberry Street.
If you're trying to teach your child good manners, in the old kind of Victorian sense of that word, you might not think that Mulberry Street is such a good example, because it's wild and it talks about fabricating stories.
With a roar of its motor, an airplane appears and dumps out confetti while everyone cheers. And that makes a story that's really not bad, but it still could be better. Suppose that I add a Chinese man who eats with sticks, a big magician doing tricks, a 10-foot beard that needs a comb. No time for more. I'm almost home. For I had a story that no one could beat. And to think that I saw it on Mulberry Street.
27 publishers turned the book down, most saying it lacked a moral. When Vanguard Press finally published Mulberry Street, sales were modest, but Peter Rabbit author Beatrix Potter praised it for what she called the truthful simplicity of the untruthfulness. For Ted Geisel, the book's success was bittersweet. The person who had instilled in him a love of rhyme never got to share in it. On March 8, 1931, Henrietta Seuss Geisel died of brain cancer. She was 52 years old.
Ted had been very close to his mother growing up, and she'd been very instrumental in, I think, encouraging him. And what he did was good, and he should do that. And it was very hard.
Shortly after their mother's death, Ted's beloved sister Marnie, newly divorced, moved back to Springfield with her daughter Peggy to care for their father. Feeling her own life had ground to a halt, Marnie spiraled into alcoholism and rarely left the house. Her father disapproved in customary fashion. He stopped speaking to her. She believed her brother's absence meant that he felt the same way. In 1945, at the age of 43, Marnie Geisel died of a heart attack at her childhood home. Guilt-ridden, Ted was unable to talk about it for the rest of his life.
And I think there also was this thread of, could I have made a difference if I'd been around? And he wasn't, because he was moving on and in another part of America. But part of his protection, I think, was not to allow himself to spend his life in grief. And perhaps that's why he found such joy in doing the outrageous books he did.
Ted dedicated his follow-up to Mulberry Street to an imaginary child he named Chrysanthemum Pearl. Due to an illness early in their marriage, Helen was unable to have children. Niece Peggy became a surrogate daughter. Years later, Ted and Helen hosted her wedding in their home.
She didn't replace my mother. She didn't become my mother. But she gave me so much guidance without it being obvious. It was an example she set. You just wanted to be like someone who was very aware of other people's feelings.
Her husband, an introvert by nature, would always depend on people who weren't. Bennett Cerf, famous wit and legendary publisher at Random House, understood before anyone else how modern media could turn authors into celebrities.
Plus, my dad, I think, really brought something to Ted that Ted was good at, but had never figured out how to do. Ted knew how to sell flit, and he knew how to sell other things brilliantly, but he hadn't really sold himself the way my dad realized that he could sell Ted.
Bennett told Ted that he would publish anything he did. Geisel tested him with his first Dr. Seuss book for an adult market, one featuring the exploits of a band of nude women. The Seven Lady Godivas was an instant failure. Ted henceforth reserved his bawdy humor for his friends.
If you look at the end paper, there's a little bucket hanging from a branch, and there's a little cut in the branch, and out of the cut comes a drop of sap, and the sap is labeled Bennett Cerf. And this was Ted's comment on Bennett for publishing the book, so he obviously knew that it was a chancy undertaking. But of course Bennett wanted to do it because that was the way he got Ted to Random House, and what a prize that was.
In 1940, Theodore Geisel's new publisher, Random House, hit pay dirt with the first Dr. Seuss book to contain an outright moral. But unlike traditional children's stories, Ted made it fun.
I've heard again and again from people, oh, you can't preach. Oh, you can't moralize. Oh, children don't like that. And my response is, no. Children don't like phony preaching. They don't like phony moralizing. They don't like bad writing. But in the hands of a gifted preacher, there is nothing more powerful than a great lesson.
Horton Hatches the Egg is the story of an elephant who is persuaded to mind a nest egg the mother has abandoned. For 51 long weeks, rain, snow, taunting animals, and hunters cannot tear Horton away from his post.
Shoot if you must, but I won't run away. I meant what I said, and I said what I meant. An elephant's faithful 100%.
The negligent mother finally returns after all the hard work is done and tries to reclaim the egg.
Poor Horton backed down with a sad, heavy heart. But at that very instant, the egg burst apart, and out of the pieces of red and white shell from the egg that he'd sat on so long and so well, Horton the elephant saw something whiz. It had ears and a tail and a trunk just like his. My goodness, my gracious, they shouted. My word, it's something brand new. It's an elephant bird. And it should be, it should be, it should be like that. Because Horton was faithful. He sat and he sat. He meant what he said and he said what he meant. And they sent him home happy, 100%.
Horton Hatches the Egg quickly sold more copies than any Dr. Seuss book before it and remains one of his most beloved stories. It would also be the last book Theodor Geisel would write for 7 years. As he was working on Horton, Ted continually found himself sketching murderous cartoons of Hitler and Mussolini instead of elephants and birds. In late 1940, he showed one of them to an old friend who quickly got him a job at the liberal newspaper, PM. At a time when most Americans prefer to stay out of the so-called European war, Ted's cartoons drove home the horrors of fascism and folly of American isolationism.
I think a great cartoonist makes a great statement. Most of his were wonderful, encouraging statements. But he was a simple-minded cartoonist. But by definition, cartoonists are simple-minded. It's hard to get across subtle, complex shades of gray in a cartoon. He was a propagandist. His cartoons were pro-America, anti-Axis, and they were fine cartoons.
I think the fact his family was from Germany made the war situation painful and probably made him more determined to rise above and prove how he felt about America, how his parents and his grandparents had in fact felt.
Ted would not serve his country in Europe, but from Hollywood. Too old to fight, 38-year-old Geisel, accompanied by his wife Helen, moved to Los Angeles, where the Army had enlisted the film industry to do what it did best. Hollywood director Frank Capra challenged Ted to create a series of cartoons that would reach young GIs who were not responding to conventional training films. Ted collaborated with animator Chuck Jones, creator of Bugs Bunny and Daffy Duck. With rhymes by Seuss, they produced a series about a soldier who does nothing right.
I just learned a secret. It's a honey. It's a pip. But the enemy is listening, so I'll never let it slip. 'Cause when I learn a secret, boy, I zipper up my lip. It's a cinch to keep a secret if a fella just takes care. He's sailing on a troop ship. Now we got to find out where. I'm a sound and silent soldier, just as steady as a rock. Here's to my little secret with its chain and padlock.
These are these very simple little films that were done to teach these farm boys, these kids, probably most of them are illiterate. They've, been drafted into the Army. They're going overseas. They don't know anything about anything. And they're getting these lessons in, change your socks or your feet will rot, or don't talk to that babe in the bar because she's got a tape recorder hidden in her brassiere.
Ted and Chuck used adult humor to capture soldiers' attention. Humor that would never have made it past censors if produced for the general public.
Traps.
for Ted's most important assignment, Frank Capra would permit no cartoons and no humor. He wanted him to write and produce an orientation film to be shown after the war to occupation forces. The words, written by the grandson of German immigrants, pulled no punches.
Someday, the German people might be cured of their disease. The super race disease. The world conquest disease. But they must prove that they have been cured, beyond the shadow of a doubt, before they ever again are allowed to take their place among respectable nations. Until that day, we stand guard.
After the war, Hollywood producers repackaged Ted's documentaries and took home Academy Awards for his efforts. But the Geisels had fallen in love with California, and Ted would try his hand at screenwriting. When producers mutilated his scripts, he gave up collaboration Hollywood style. After a 7-year hiatus, Dr. Seuss would re-emerge to conquer the world of children's literature.
Once the war was over, almost everyone seemed to have the same dream. A vine-covered cottage, some kids, and a dog.
As Theodore Geisel's potential readership expanded at a record pace, Dr. Seuss ended his 7-year absence from children's literature with McElligot's Pool.
Answered Marco. It may be you're right. I've been here 3 hours without one single bite. There might be no fish, but again, well, there might. Because you never can tell what goes on down below. This pool might be bigger than you or I know.
Because I was a little kid, McElligot's Pool was probably the #1 bestseller in history in my mind because it was my favorite book. But in fact, it sold rather modestly at that time.
But Ted's only book using watercolors would become a treasured collector's item among illustrators.
Oh, the sea is so full of a number of fish. If a fellow is patient, he might get his wish. And that's why I think that I'm not such a fool when I sit here and fish in McElligot's Pool.
In 1947, the Geisels bought an observation tower atop Mount Soledad overlooking the sleepy beach town of La Jolla. Helen and Ted, 2 East Coast natives, set about building their California dream home. It became a whimsical retreat with a landscape that appeared to have sprung from the imagination of Dr. Seuss. A place where Ted Geisel would do his finest work. He'd put in long hours, 7 days a week, often retiring just before dawn.
He was a fantasist, you know. He'd make his drink, light his cigarette, go in his study at midnight and start thinking crazy, you know.
Helen cleared the way for her husband to create by managing the household, doing many tasks herself.
I really, really enjoyed Helen Geisel, who was a very skillful editor, a very loyal, devoted wife, but unfortunately she had an ulcer, so she drank milk while we drank martinis.
She was an incredible studying influence and could figure out maybe where Ted was going to be when he calmed down. that when he got overly excited about something, she might see that he might not like it so much the next day. And if he was totally fed up with something, she could see that it was really pretty good and that it might be important for Ted not to throw it out just yet.
Over the next decade, Ted released 1 Dr. Seuss book a year with modest but progressively higher sales.
I think there was some opposition because the books didn't fit into a certain kind of traditional idea of what kids' books should be, particularly primers. You know, there was a very prim attitude toward the primer.
The juvenile bestseller lists were dominated by books that were cute, sentimental, and safe.
Ted wasn't interested in expanding the envelope. He didn't acknowledge that there was an envelope. One Beyond Zebra is the wildest book I've ever seen because it's about the alphabet after Z. And he made up funny, crazy letters that, that make a kind of Seussian sense.
I think that in the end, the thing that I always think of when I think of Seuss is I think of kids. The stars of Seuss's material, the focus of his material are children who go through something. They go in one end of something and come out the other end of this psychedelic world. You wonder what this guy was on when he was writing these things, maybe.
There was among that kids' book establishment a kind of a residual sense that Dr. Seuss was the Quick Henry the Flit guy. They really couldn't quite understand how that translated into this world of children. And I think you had to wait for them all to die.
Ted's childhood remained a limitless source of inspiration. Whenever he returned to Springfield, he would visit the zoo, still run by his father.
It's a pretty good zoo, said young Gerald McGrew. And the fellow who runs it seems proud of it, too. But if I ran the zoo, said young Gerald McGrew, I'd make a few changes. That's just what I'd do. I'd open each cage. I'd unlock every pen, let the animals go, and start over again. And somehow or other, I think I could find some beasts of a much more unusual kind.
Well, I think he allowed a child's imagination to guide where he was going to take his stories.
I'll bring back a gusset, a gherkin, a gasket, and also a gooch from the wilds of Nantasket. And 8 Persian princes will carry the basket. But what their names are, I don't know, so don't ask it. Then the whole town will gasp, why, this boy never sleeps. No keeper before ever kept what he keeps. There's no telling what that young fellow will do. And then, just to show them, I'll sail to Catrue and bring back an Itcutch, a Preep, and a Prue. A Nurgle, a Nerd, and a Seersucker, too. Wow, they'll all cheer. What this zoo must be worth. It's the gall-darndest zoo on the face of the earth.
My dad used to say, and it's important to remember that he published Eugene O'Neill and William Faulkner and John O'Hara and all kinds of other people, but he always used to say that Ted was the true genius of all of those people, and he would say that in public, sometimes annoying some of those other authors.
Despite his bad experiences in Hollywood, Ted held out hope that he would one day make a feature film. He got the chance with his story called The 5,000 Fingers of Dr. T.
It happens in an amazing castle with a tickle-em-to-death torture chamber and a 500-player piano with 480,000 keys.
When he got a producer and was to make this wonderfully delicious film of a little boy running over giant piano keys, Hollywood said you have to have love interest, and Ted was screaming, I don't want a love interest, I want that little boy running over the piano, and he wanted to make pure fantasy.
Dr. T is sweet on Mrs. C. So is Mr. Z, the plumber, who fixes sinks.
He says, I did a movie once. I thought it was going to be great. And I'm never going to get over it.
Ted called the flop the biggest failure of his career and vowed never to make another film. Hollywood is not suited for me, he said, and I am not suited for it. Ted returned to the tower to work on his books with Helen.
She was supportive of Ted. She understood Ted's talent, and he wouldn't have been Dr. Seuss without her. He trusted her absolutely.
In May of 1954, Ted would become incapable of working when his wife contracted Guillain-Barré syndrome, a rare disease similar to polio. A paralysis started in her feet and crept up her body until she was paralyzed to the neck. Unable to breathe on her own, Helen was placed in an iron lung.
Because for a while, there was doubt as to whether she would live. Going through that period where he thought he was losing her was just tremendous. He focused in on her, and he was strong for her, but it was a dreadful period.
Helen's paralysis eventually receded with treatment. After months of rehabilitation, she learned to talk and walk again, although she never completely recovered.
I'm sure she knew he was already tremendously burdened and that in worrying about her and that it would affect his time to work, and she wanted him to feel free to work. But she told me once, I always feel as if my shoes are 2 sizes too small. I think she lived with discomfort from then on, but boy, they worked through that together.
Elementary Schoolroom, USA. It's a wonderful part of the American scene.
When the children of the post-war baby boom were reaching school age, it was a time of unprecedented prosperity. Many parents could look forward to providing their kids with a college education, if only they could read. Illiteracy rates soared as television became a distraction, and the old-time readers seemed more boring and irrelevant than ever.
The Dick and Jane books were so white bread, you know, middle class, the children were so clean and so obedient and so nice and not at all like little children.
Those cherubic, blonde Aryan children really were, I think, the precursor to my whole lack of self-esteem, because I think it kind of set the bar for this perfection that I never had for a second in my life.
With the Why Johnny Can't Read controversy in the national spotlight, 51-year-old Ted Geisel accepted a challenge to write and illustrate a reader using a list of only 225 words. I read the list 40 times, Ted said, and got more and more discouraged. It was trying to make a strudel without any strudels. Desperate, he decided to write a story around the first 2 words that rhymed, cat and hat. Over the period of 1 year, the book slowly came together. The most important thing about me, Ted once said, is that I work like hell, write, rewrite, reject, re-reject, and polish incessantly. To write a 60-page book, I write more than 1,000 pages before I'm satisfied.
The sun did not shine. It was too wet to play. So we sat in the house all that cold, cold, wet day. All we could do was to sit, 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 and we did not like it. Not one little bit.
And of course, Ted introduced chaos and, you know, the way kids really behave and the things that they're sort of scared about and fascinated about as well.
We looked, then we saw him step in on the mat. We looked, and we saw him, the cat in the hat. And he said to us, "Why do you sit there like that? I know it is wet and the sun is not sunny, but we can have lots of good fun that is funny."
But the way Ted used these words over and over again was fun and exciting, because it was all involved with action and something happening all the time.
Look at me! Look at me! Look at me now! It is fun to have fun, but you have to know how. I can hold up the cup, and the milk, and the cake. I can hold up these books, and the fish on the rake.
You know, I remember the Cat in the Hat came into these kids' lives and took them on this odyssey. I mean, I guess I thought of him as somewhat of an anarchist. You know, of course, I didn't know the word.
He was fun. I mean, the lessons he taught you were not the same way anybody else taught you. I mean, you'd have somebody come in and destroy that cat, destroyed the whole house. You remember that? That's what children do. And they get caught. Somebody comes in and catches them. He had that vision.
That is good, said the fish. He has gone away, yes, but your mother will come. She will find this big mess, and this mess is so big and so deep and so tall, we cannot pick it up. There's no way at all. And then, who was back in the house? Why, the cat. Have no fear of this mess, said the Cat in the Hat. I always pick up all my playthings, and so I will show you another good trick that I know. And he put them away. Then he said, "That is that." And then he was gone with a tip of his hat. Then our mother came in, and she said to us two, "Did you have any fun? Tell me, what did you do?" Should we tell her about it? Now, what should we do? Well, what would you do if your mother asked you?
The possibility of somebody finding out that would have been way too powerful for me. I wouldn't have been able to sleep at night. I would have been one of those kids who woke up in the middle of the night, "Mommy, I gotta tell you something. A cat came. He was in the house and he cleaned it up. I'm so sorry." You know, I mean, I just couldn't have held that in.
Released in the spring of 1957, The Cat in the Hat quickly became a national phenomenon. Newsweek declared Ted the Moppet's Milton. Within 3 years, it sold nearly 1 million copies at $1.95 each.
The message of the cat and the world's acceptance, love, embracing of the cat were so powerful that the old ideas about Ted being an old-fashioned cartoonist who had no place in kids' books, I think, dissolved very quickly in front of that onslaught.
The book is currently available in 26 languages, and in 2003 became a big-budget feature film.
Cut. There are differences, but they're all sort of born out of the world that was created by Theodore Geisel and the characters that were created by Theodore Geisel. And we've made them extreme.
This cat should not be here. He should not be about. He should not be here when your mother is out.
He once said, "When I'm gone, things will be different because the creator will be gone." And there are different ways to look at this. That on some level, things may be happening now that he kind of sniffs his nose at.
We had read Dr. Seuss to the children. There was a nice, lovely rhythm about what he wrote. But when Random House published The Cat in the Hat, I flipped.
Bennett Cerf's wife Phyllis joined Ted and Helen Geisel to form a company that would publish books intended for very young children to read by themselves. Random House would be their distributor.
Basically, what my mom and Ted and Helen did when the beginner book started was to take the Dick and Jane formula, to take the exact vocabulary that those books used and the same way of introducing a few words at a time and only putting a few words on a page, and just say, this is going to be crazy, instead of, it's just going to be, look at this and see that. But these books sold in a way that nothing Ted had written before sold.
20 years after his first book for children, Theodore Geisel became Random House's best-selling author. His book royalties were a mere $5,000 the year before he took the Cat in the Hat Challenge. In 1959, they totaled $200,000. Dr. Seuss was hailed as the savior of children's literacy.
We herald Harry Potter as this something that made kids want to read, and you know that's why it's so successful. This man really invented reading for many kids.
And that was really the beginning of Dr. Seuss's real fame. Before that, he was the icing on the cake. He wasn't the cake. You know, they had a rhythm. They had style. They had humor. What was there to dislike about them? They were, in a sense, what the funny papers strived to do. And Ted Geisel was the Renoir of funny papers, is all I can tell you.
The Cat in the Hat phenomenon forced a private man into the public eye. Ted Geisel, who hated crowds, cameras, and interviews, had one more challenge to face: children.
He had had almost no experience with them, so he didn't know how to act around them. He was a naturally shy person, even around adults. But with children, that shyness was magnified tremendously.
At the beginning, he was sometimes quite stiff. As he made appearances, he got better and better and realized that talking to them as he signed was something they liked.